All right, welcome to another podcast. In this one, I want you guys to prepare yourself for some really awesome information. I'm with Dr. Gabriel Weiss, and like my other podcasts, we've already been on the phone for quite a while, and I had to hit stop on our earlier conversation because it was so good. And I want Gabe to share the nuggets with you that the gems, the pearls that we were covering. So first, I want, if you could, talk a little bit about what you're going to present on at Symposium. I know you're coming to Symposium, the Pacific Symposium in November, and the title is 12 Official Physiology in Clinical Practice. It's based on the work that's going into your next book. You've already translated a book that was published in 2019, more on that in a moment. But in your words, please share a little bit about your 3-hour workshop. It's on the 4th of November at Symposium. This topic, you and I, please also include the discussion that we had before I hit record on the holographic nature versus holotropic nature that you see out in the world. And welcome to the podcast, and I'm so excited for you to share this with everybody.
Yeah, hi. Well, let's see. So yes, my lecture is, the title of the lecture, I think might be a little misleading there. The focus of my lecture is primarily is chapter 8 of the Yellow Emperor's Classic of the Simple Questions. And it is the Linglan Midian Lun, which is the kind of secret treatise of the library of the miraculous orchid. And there's a lot you can kind of read into the title and whatnot. But essentially that chapter describes the 12 officials, or the 12 offices, what are referred to as Guan. And it essentially creates a metaphorical description of these 12 organs that are in the body, with reference to their role in kind of I guess you could think of it as a government. So in the description of my lecture, I use the word cybernetic, kind of the cybernetic relationships of the organs in the body. And this passage, cybernetic, the word cybernetic, it sounds funny, but it really is simply a system with independent or individual actors that react toward one another and regulate one another through the role that they play with one another. So in the human body, of course, in Chinese medicine, each organ, the activity of each organ is modified, and it responds to the activities of other organs. And of course, we're familiar with this type of network dynamic on multiple levels as students of Chinese medicine. We have the 5 phases, or the 5 elements. We have the 12 organs. We have very basic ones like yin and yang, fullness and emptiness. So in this passage, I think it's very interesting in that the organs are actually related toward a particular official, and each official is given a role, kind of what their role is, and then what emerges from that role. And like most of the classics, if you just read through it, you just kind of do a glossy reading of it, it's really not terribly interesting. Dr. Liu, in the book that I translated in Classical Chinese Medicine, in the first part of that book, he references this, I think, very important point, which is if you just read the classics and you just kind of read over them, it's kind of like, oh yeah, I knew that, and it doesn't seem either profound or interesting. But and he gives this description of people, other practitioners who will have the Yellow Emperor's Classic on their desk, kind of in a pile of other books, collecting dust, and then they have all these and this is his description, they have all of these current journal articles and textbooks on, modern physiology and pharmacology and, current scientific studies, in particular herbs and things like that. And the classics themselves are like become almost entirely neglected. And I totally understand that impulse, because when you're reading a textbook, say a textbook on some particular disease, epidemiology, pathology, there's all this detail. Everything is written out in vast detail. So each paragraph, each chapter, each section of the book goes deeply into whatever subject you're looking at. If you're looking at the heart, there's all these details and things. So when you're in practice, you can, and you see these particular detailed instances, you can refer back to this information that you have, in books on biochemistry or nutrition or whatever it is that you're looking at or thinking about that day. Whereas with the classics, you have this very condensed, what seems like a very condensed passage. So this particular chapter follows this rhythmic repetition. There are only a handful of characters that are used. There are a number of characters that repeat themselves throughout the first paragraph, and then there are just a handful of these individual characters. But when I was teaching the integrative anatomy, physiology, and biochemistry, at that time I was fascinated by, and I've always been with the Chinese language. I was fascinated by the etymology. I can remember when I first started learning Chinese, when I was learning the characters, I really wanted to know what this was a picture of. My first Chinese professor, Hyung Ru, who's Korean, was an absolutely amazing Chinese professor. He had the character there. Every once in a while, I would say, "Oh, and this is a bed, this is a person," and I would ask him, "Well, what are these other parts though? Like how many, what's this?" And he wasn't that interested in it himself. His interest lay elsewhere. He was into poetry and things like that, but he wasn't interested in the etymology. Whereas I really wanted to understand what the kind of the nuts and bolts of the character were. And this for me was an interest or a passion that I had even before I got into Chinese. Even when I was just reading books as a high school age student, I loved learning the etymology of words, seeing where they came from, what they were constructed of, what they really meant. And a lot of the meaning, the word would kind of come alive when I understood the etymology, because within the etymology you have the analogy, which makes the word work. So all of our thought, all of the things that we're trying to convey through words or ideas or larger constructions like sentences or paragraphs or essays or stories or whatever it is, they're all more or less elaborate analogies. There's a book called Surfaces and Essences by the same author who wrote Gödel, Escher, Bach. He talks all about, it's Douglas Hofstadter. He talks all about how all of our thought, in Surfaces and Essences, he goes into it in very, he goes through it very exhaustively. He shows how all thought, all ideas are essentially exercises in analogy. So one of the problems, and this is something that Pedro Domingo pointed out in his book on the master algorithm, one of the problems in trying to teach a machine to think or to speak the way a human does. So one of the obstacles to even achieving the what is referred to as the singularity in the tech world, in artificial intelligence, when artificial intelligence will become truly intelligent the way that the human mind is this inability to grasp analogy. So you and I use analogy all of the time. We use it without even thinking. So every time we do something one way and we run into a situation that's similar but different, it could be a very different context. For instance, we could have a bucket with a hole in it and we want to plug the leak. And so we find something malleable, sort of squishy, that we can stick in the hole to keep the bucket from leaking. all of that, something squishy to stick in the hole, and all those words, everything that I just said to you that you immediately grasped and understood, all of that was analogical. And so you could come to a completely different situation. It could be a situation where you have a secret that you want to keep, that you don't want anyone to find out, and someone else knows about it, and you're afraid that they're going to tell people, or maybe they've already started telling people, and you want to go and kind of plug that hole. You want to stop that leak. That's all an analogy. So two totally different. For a robot would look at it and go, "What the fuck? Excuse me, what's
I don't
going on?"
understand.
Over here we have a bucket with a hole in it. Over here we have a person who has information. They don't see how those two things are similar. But to us, it's eminently, it makes complete sense. And Chinese language, Ezra Pound, when I was in college, I read a work by Ezra Pound who talked about Chinese poetry. We were going through a book of poetry called Sunflower Splendor. We weren't reading all of it, but we were reading these poems over and over, and not over and over. We were reading various poems, and Charles Wu, my professor at the time, was like, you really can't grasp the poetry, the real beauty of the poetry, unless you are looking at the characters. Because as Ezra Pound pointed out, in the written Chinese poetry, you can actually see people. You can see flowers. For instance, if you look at the flower for the character for a lotus flower, you have the grass radical, and then you have this radical for a wheel, for a cart with wheels on it, and then you have this character for movement. And so you might ask yourself, like, well, what does a lotus have to do with a wheel? But if you're actually familiar with lotuses, you will see that motif plays out, this motif of a chariot moving, of a wheel moving. It plays out throughout everything that you can see with the lotus. So if you've ever seen a lotus pod, it has this kind of circular shape with these holes in it. It looks a lot like a wheel, and that then is shaped. It goes to a long kind of, looks like an axle, a long stem that's like an axle. But the image of the lotus with this wheel on an axle, when you see it kind of sitting there, it looks just like as you might imagine, a wooden wheel on a chariot kind of moving through space. And then the lotus itself, with this very well illustrated cycle of the seed dropping out, falling into the muck, and then emerging as a flower again. There's a wheel there. And I could go on and on about just that one single character. And then when you get into looking at the etymological forms that were in use for that particular part of the character at the time when the word for lotus was first being recorded in 2 dimensions, you start to see how, to the early Chinese thinker, to the early Chinese, I don't even want to call them intellectual, just human being, who was trying to take these 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional really entities, because they exist in time and space, and record them somehow into 2 dimensions on 3 dimensions. It's 2 dimensions on on a flat surface.
Mm-hmm.
These etymological forms kind of become these shadows of these very complex 4-dimensional entities. So the original and the original title of Dr. Liu Lihong's book, Sukao Zhongyi, it was nature and its relationship to time. So he talks a lot about the way that time plays out through, in the cosmos. So for him, I think a lot of times in Chinese medicine, we often think about things in terms of 3 dimensions, even when we're thinking about the various phases and elements of things. But for him, time was a huge part of it. That's sort of a tangent. Where I was going with that was, when you think about the Chinese language as it was first being recorded, 2,500 years ago, into a form like the Yellow Emperor's Classic, where you had this it was still a relatively young language. And by a young language, I don't mean that it had first come into being. It was just now leaving its kind of natural state. what Steven Pinker often refers to as this, the native state of a language. So the native state of a language is in nature, out in nature, human beings in nature, cheek and jowl with nature, and it's spoken language. So the written language that we're referring to in the classics, this was like its kind of first distillation out in 2 dimensions. But for the longest time, for 99 point whatever percent of human history, where we've been able to think very complex thoughts, and we've had, these huge oral traditions, systems of medicine, cosmologies, myths, very elaborate. We tend to think of pre-literate societies as being somehow primitive in their maybe in their storytelling or their descriptions of the world. But even our classics, when you think about Homer's The Odyssey or the Iliad, these were oral traditions. So they were recorded much later. They were written down, but they had, the whole story was out there. People would be able to sit down, a bard or whoever it was who was these storytellers, they would be able to recite the entirety of the Odyssey, the entirety of the Iliad in one sitting. They would be able to sit down and spew the whole thing out in one sitting. And someone else there whose job it was back in the day to hear these stories would be able to hear it in one sitting. And then that person could go on to another valley and spew it all out again. And it would be more or less the same thing. And of course, with those types of writings, they had these, there were certain devices, mnemonic devices that were used to allow people to be able to memorize these very elaborate and detailed forms. And those mnemonic devices are still there. The Yellow Emperor's Classic is filled with them. One mnemonic device is to create a dialogue where you have one person talking to another person. And this makes it a lot easier to remember, because you and I, if you and I are having this conversation now, and you might have a conversation, say, with someone else, the human mind is geared towards remembering conversations because we're social beings. And over the past however many millions of years that we've been using our brains to use spoken language, so much of that language was who said what to who, what did they say, going back and forth. So you can have a long conversation, a 2-hour conversation with someone. You can then go and talk to someone else, or you could be talking on the phone, and you could probably go through that conversation. There's always a game of telephone there, but you can remember a lot from a conversation. I said this, then they said this. And if it's an intense conversation, like an argument or something like that, you can remember a lot of those details and things. And so in the Yellow Emperor's Classic, it's a conversation. It's a conversation between Huangdi and Chibo. So this passage, it starts with the Yellow Emperor. He and throughout the, I don't want to start reading from the book, but throughout the Yellow Emperor's Classic, throughout the Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor will first ask something, and then Chibo will answer it. That's one level of the mnemonic device. But the other level is the Yellow Emperor's question, Huangdi's question, is very often kind of elaborate and kind of free-formed. But the answer is very regularly this kind of rhythmic recounting of things through a particular formula. These formulaic forms, that could be 4 or 8 character lines, or 9 or 10 character lines, but they will just swap out a few characters, a few ideas from each line. And so if you memorize one part of it, you then have 10 or 12 lines memorized, because all you have to do is remember, well, the heart, then you just have to remember Shenming and Junju, and you have the whole rest of the formula. You have the spiritual brightness, and then you have Junju. The Jun is like the sovereign, and Ju is like the ruler. But in my lecture at the Pacific Symposium, I'll go into the etymology of those individual characters. But where I was trying to get to with that in terms of the etymology is these individual elements that they place in there. For instance, Jun, this character Jun, which is often translated as sovereign, or in translations of the I Ching, like Wilhelm Barnes' translation of the I Ching, which is still my favorite translation, in part because it has it has Carl Jung's introduction to the I Ching, which talks about a lot of the things that I'm interested in, synchronicity, this use of archetypes and these kind of forms and whatnot. But in any case, that character Jun is translated as like the gentleman or the superior man, calls it the superior man, which already there's some issues there. But Jun as a character itself, it has a hand holding an instrument, some sort of writing utensil, so writing, and then it has the mouth. So Jun really it's the written language or the act of writing language, and then the act of speaking. But when you think about these things, we write with our right hand. We don't write with our left hand. We write with our right hand, and we speak with our mouth. These two parts of the human being, this ability to write and to speak, it's this linear. It's the linear transmission of thought through time. So when you write, you're writing things out in a line. When you're speaking, you're taking one sound at a time, and you're placing them one after another in order to say something intelligent. If you take the letters that are in any book and you scramble them up, you change their order in time, you change the order in which we look at them, it becomes nonsense. If you wanted to create a code, you could scramble those up, and you could give someone a decoder that would allow you to jump around in space, but order them together in time, and you'd have something intelligent there. It's the same with speech. The sounds that I'm making of themselves are simply sounds. It could be singing, it could be humming, it could be nonsense. But when you put them together in a particular order, all of a sudden you have some information that's being transmitted from one person to the other. The information exists in a non-linear state. The information exists in a non-temporal state in the world. But in order for us to actually transmit it and make sense of it, it has to be turned into this linear form. And that linear form through time is essentially an expression of some type of analogy. It's an analogical type of expression that's made. And so a story, a myth, many of us, myself included, were fascinated by myths as children. What is it about these myths, about these Greek myths, these stories that are really so outdated, but they're so fascinating. They're better than other stories. I mean, I don't know if you ever had that feeling, but I would read other stories. But when I was reading the Greek myths and things, those stories were different somehow. And to my mind, the reason why those analogies, those stories are different somehow is they were distilled out as the myths of the gods, because they really were illustrating these archetypal forms that emerge everywhere throughout our world. We find them all over the place. The reason why, when we're 10, 11, 12, 13, when our the part of our brain that processes language and processes time and consequences and everything else like that is really forming, and we're getting a sense of the way the world works in terms of time in that way. The reason why I believe we're so fascinated by these myths, these Ur stories, these original deep archetypal stories, is because they resonate with all of this information that we're getting all the time from the world around us, that seems kind of nonsensical and varied and how can I describe it? Circumstantial, but is actually tied in with the kind of the core essence of how our world, our solar system, how human life is kind of working with itself. And when you think about the Greek myths, or even the elements in Chinese medicine, and you have like the solar system, we are existing on this spaceship that's somehow finely tuned, and this is all now coming to light with modern physics. These planets that are out there, human life as we know it right now wouldn't exist. We wouldn't have it the way that we have it if it weren't for these planets being lined up just exactly as they are. You take a planet out of there and things start to go haywire, and human life and life as we know it, this cosmos that we have, wouldn't exist as we are. So the biosphere, where we have living things, what's supporting that extends out into this cosmos. And when the early Chinese thinkers that were or I don't even want to call them thinkers, just people that were on the planet, they would see the fire star, Mars, this reddish star that they could see. There was no light pollution or anything like that. They could climb up on a mountain. They could look out. They could see this reddish star. They could see its rhythm because there wasn't any TV to watch. What there was, if you wanted to look out and know the mind of the cosmos, you would look up into the sky. But they would see the rhythm of it. They would see the light, the quality of its energy, and everything else. And they would realize that this whole Xing, this fire star, was related to, you know, the fire in the body and the cycles of fire that they would see out in the world, both in time and space, and in terms of, you know, what's referred to as the doctrine of signatures. But it's really just the kind of imminent information that we're getting from the world all around us all the time, that makes immediate sense to us just based on our biology, psychology, whatever you want to call it. Where was I going with that? I'm sorry. I kind of
no. This, I mean, I am getting entranced with this. And a thought that occurred to me when you were beautifully describing how we interface with the cosmos and how all the planets have to be perfectly aligned for us to exist.
Yes.
Can we bring that back to your talk and say that that's the microcosm within the macrocosm, in that
Yes.
the 12 officials, if you remove one of them, it's like chaos ensues,
absolutely.
and then you don't have a living, breathing body. I mean, that's what we were talking about before I hit record, is that we're seeing these patterns everywhere, holotropically, and
Yes.
we were talking about that, and I think you're right in there. You're right on that vein of concept.
So thank you for bringing me back down to earth, because in the 12 officials, the first official that's described is the heart. And after they go through all the officials, it says that, you know, the ruler, which Junju, Shanming Qian, if the ruler is not bright, then essentially, all manner of disease can emerge in the body. And it became clear to me early on when they were talking about the heart, the Shin, which is really heart and mind. They mean that Shin, the character Shin, means both heart and mind in Chinese medicine. So Xin Li Xue, studying what's in the heart, is psychology. But when they talk about the organs, they have the Xin Zang, the organ of the heart. But I can remember when I was looking at, when I was teaching anatomy, physiology, and biochemistry, when I was looking at when I was reading biochemistry, it was actually this Stryer version of biochemistry there, which is still the best edition of that particular book, that biochemistry book. He talked about mitochondria, and one of the first ways that they discovered mitochondria was they discovered the cardiolipin, which is kind of it makes up the waxy membrane of the mitochondria, which is inside the cell. And so when they found this cardiolipin first, when they took the heart tissue and they really just boiled it down. When they boiled down the heart tissue, they would get this fat that they didn't get as much of from other tissues. You get some from skeletal tissue and other things, but in the heart, you get a lot of this cardiolipin, and it was a waxy type of fat. And this waxy fat is what sort of insulates the mitochondria and allows for the proton transport chain, this voltage to be created between the outside and the inside of the mitochondrial membrane. It's a double membrane with this kind of crystalline matrix on the inside of it. But in any case, right away I was like, that's fascinating, because why is it that mitochondria are so prominent in the heart? And when I started looking at mitochondria and looking at their role in the human body, and then looking at the role that the Chinese posited for the heart in the human body, I realized that, yeah, there is the organ of the heart, but the description of the heart in Chinese medicine overlaps way better with mitochondria and mitochondrial function than it does with the physical organ of the heart. Those two things don't overlap. The physical organ of the heart, you can look at the pericardium. You can look at a lot of different. You can look at various other organs, and they will all interrelate with the heart there. But when you look at mitochondria and their role in health and disease, it really fits with the heart. And there's a book that recently came out here. I read it. I'm going to read it again. It's by Nick Lane. It's called Power, Sex, Suicide, Mitochondria and the Meaning of Life. But he is just kind of riffing on and expanding on all this information that's emerging about mitochondria and their role in the development of eukaryotic cells and their role in developing macrocosmic life as you and I know it. I mean, people often, when we think about evolution, we often think about, there was bacteria and they slowly developed into, the kind of macrocosmic life that we see, today. But in fact, it was a bacteria together with this archaebacteria, these very primitive type of bacteria that what are referred to as bacteria, but these two different types of organisms. One that is now the mitochondria that lives in all of our cells, and the other, which is that it kind of gave it a place to live, but gave it all this kind of like equipment to work with. It was that union that generated life in the human body. And now where am I going with this? I guess the reason why I'm bringing this up, I guess to some extent, is when you look at mitochondrial function in the body and you look at the etymology of the characters that are referred to in the line for the heart, you can easily see how those two things how they were talking about the same thing. In fact, I kind of see them as two sides of the same coin. And the coin itself is ineffable. It can't really be communicated in words, because both all of our understanding of, say, mitochondria and all of our understanding of the heart in Chinese medicine, those are both still metaphors for, for the heart, life and the fire of life, or mind, since it's heart and mind. And I could kind of go on and on about that. But for instance, if you take the character for shun, for spirit, you have the part on the left, you have the character for above, so something from above. And then you have these three lines, which are often thought to refer to as the three lights coming down from above. But it's three things coming down from above. But that number 3 becomes important because in Chinese numerology and cosmology and Chinese thought, 3 is shorthand for the 10,000 things, for like the multifarious, multifaceted world that we see around us. Once you have 1 and then 2, but once you have 3, the relationship between the two, now you have everything. You have all this stuff, the 10,000 things. But the part on the right, this character shun, which is to extend, it's different from shun, but it gives it its meaning. That was actually a lightning bolt. So it was this early form of the lightning bolt that gradually evolved into this character that we see today, which looks like a very simple tic-tac-toe board with a line kind of extending through it. I didn't describe it very well. If I had a chalkboard, I could draw it for you. But originally that was a lightning bolt. So the shun spirit, as it was described, was this, this light, or these things coming down from a sky from above, and then this electrical connection between the two. And when you look at mitochondria at the very small level, the intensity of voltage at this tiny level is equivalent to lightning. So if you were to take that tiny little millivolt transfer that's feeding all of our life, that's turning the lights on so that you and I can see one another, so that there's something here that we can like see, and which ultimately, when that fails, the lights will turn off. There won't be any more show anymore. The sun and the moon and the stars of our existence will be gone. That lightning is actually happening inside this mitochondrial membrane all of the time. And anyway, I don't want to kind of go into the lecture that I'm going to give, but it's absolutely fascinating stuff. And what's so fascinating about it is these characters are right there. We look at them because they've already been fed through this feedback loop. They become kind of nonsensical. They become the original analogy, which is right there in front of us. It's just been kind of morphed so that you have to memorize this Chinese character, maybe write it 40 times before you get it. But I guarantee you, if I draw the character for Shun, the original Oracle Bone script for it, you could draw one at any point in the next 10 years that would look a lot like some version that you would find in a book like this. So when you look at the Oracle Bone script, there are all these different versions of the original script. So it wasn't like they had an alphabet that was clearly defined. So, here we have this animal, this deer with its antlers, and then this entrance with its footprints there. It transforms later on to this character, but you can see that it took on multiple forms. There were lots of different ways of drawing this animal, lots of different ways of drawing the little shape there. So you could come up with your own version, and you would still kind of capture that same analogical information that the early Chinese thinkers were using. The other thing that I want to say, I know we're probably kind of running out of time, but the other thing that I want to say about the early kind of Chinese etymology is, I think that Todd, he's not too familiar with this type of thinking that I have. So he wanted to kind of bring it back into clinical practice. I will. I'm going to bring a case study, and I'm going to do all that stuff. But this stuff, you don't need a particular. Nobody needs me to tell them, oh, this is that. Once you get in there and you start thinking about, once oh, this is lightning, this is the electrical impulse, these are lights, and you have that in your head, it becomes immediately useful in your clinical practice because you'll be thinking about it that way. And human beings, the least intelligent human being and the most intelligent human being, they can have a conversation. You and I can have a conversation. If we were out in the garden and we were messing around with plants for a few weeks, we would both be learning from each other. We would both see things about those plants, and we'd both, oh, you put too much water on it, or hey, you stepped on this. We would both be seeing things. In working with the human body, it's not terribly different from that, in that things become too dry or they become too wet. Things become too dark or they become too light. And so the type of kind of common sense, may or may not be that common, but the type of kind of common sense, it's guided by these analogical patterns that were transmitted through the classics. But there was a time when, and these classics were emerged during this time when the human being was still part of nature. So the question of us being like in harmony with nature at that time, it wasn't as much of a question. We were still part of the fabric that made up the natural world. Our ability to kind of accord with things out in nature, these very sophisticated forms out in nature, other creatures, water, plants, stones, things like that. We had a natural, a native understanding of them from interacting with them in our everyday life, and from not having the feedback loops that currently divorce us from the natural world. So
also known as distractions, right?
Yes.
Like our phones, our computers, everyday,
absolutely,
high-tech life.
Yeah. Now, I find this an interesting thing because I'm trying to remember the name of the author, but there was a book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess. And it basically talked about how wherever the written word emerged and became dominant within a culture and a society, what is the name of that? Anyway, it'll come to me. But wherever it emerged and became dominant in human society, women were suddenly cast into a lower class. The goddess figures were torn down, and this whole kind of rewiring of the brain started to happen, where we were following this kind of linear type of thought. So we became the right hand, the writing hand, the kind of patriarchal, if you want to call it that, form. There and all these terrible travesties. You'll have to look it up. It's The Alphabet versus Goddess. It's a great book. But in that book, he actually sees hope, and I'm starting to see hope for human culture and the human mind, because this was written like in the late 70s. This was before everyone had one of these cell phones where we could get lost watching YouTube or whatever. But he saw hope in a way for the human mind, swinging back to a less patriarchal, a society less divorced from the natural world. When we started to look more at images and we started to move away from the actual written word. So I love books, and I'm not going to be able to stop kind of reading or that kind of thing. But I do kind of I think this kind of, I think we're sort of on the verge of the irony, what do I want to call it,
the return to what it used to be,
it
or
will almost
the
be like
return
a
to
book.
truth, return to
It will
the
be like,
truth.
it will be
Capital
like
T.
we're looking at our phone, we're looking at this beautiful kind of waterfall type image thing, and we're trying to engross ourselves in this world, in this thing that we've constructed, and we'll be surrounded by cement and concrete and noises and everything else, and we'll suddenly realize that we can set the phone down and walk out of the city, and we can actually be in that natural world. Like we've created this feedback loop where we're trying to kind of comfort ourselves with these devices and things, but I think every technological step we get closer and closer to this kind of hypnotist trick that we're playing on ourselves, suddenly kind of being revealed to ourselves. And what you refer to it as the return, it will suddenly, this may be how we kind of set ourselves up for that again. Maybe that the feedback gets so bad that it starts to turn back into a musical tone again. I don't know. I don't know how to.
It's definitely a return. Like, yes. I was sharing with you that I've interviewed several of the presenters for Symposium this year, and I see a theme of return to classics. Yeah. And if we look at the microcosm within the macrocosm, the holographic nature of just existence, yes, this symposium is representative of what we're seeing in the world right now, which is a return to what's important, return to the natural rhythms. I think it's exciting, it's exhilarating. I think from our conversation, not recorded and now recorded, people that come to your workshop are going to be able to actually almost have a new facet on their lens of looking at life and practice. So like you said, you're not there to tell them how to practice or protocols. Instead, they're going to leave and they're not going to see the world different, because already in this hour of talking with you, I am seeing the world around me differently, which creates that feedback loop, which will plug us into that return, which will ultimately do all the things that we're talking about. And you're right. Like, I hope you get through your lecture in 3 hours, because this topic is so dense. So I know you're a doctor of naturopathic medicine and also a physician of Chinese medicine. So you speak those languages, you translate Chinese medicine and Chinese text. So you do speak Chinese, and I bet you speak other languages as well.
Yes, German. I did a year of high school in Germany, and I have translated some German text. I translated Die Monde des I Chings by Frank Fiedler, which is a book about the I Ching, the moons of the I Ching. That would have been back in 2003 or 4. Yeah,
and it's from that. I mean, I can see and I can feel your passion for etymology and just language and its origin and how it relates to why we're here and how we interact. I mean, your 3 hours at Symposium is so profound, very similar to the analogy that you use, that we have these classics and they're on our desks and we're just like, whatever. And then we're not really understanding the depth there. We're just really not understanding the depths that's there until we take the time to look deeper. And that's what you're going to do in the 3 hours. And specifically that chapter 8 of the Yellow's Emperor's Classics, and in the 12 You call them the 12
12
officials,
officials,
right?
yeah.
Like the organ systems, but basically, I mean, even your talk, we can apply it to all the things, the way that the planets are aligned, the way the mitochondria reflect the heart in Chinese medicine. And
Absolutely.
honestly, I've never, ever heard that. I don't know if it's a concept, it's information, basically. It's, universal information of that little lightning bolt in the mitochondria.
Oh,
I mean, it's so exciting. And it's found in the characters of Chinese medicine.
It is, yeah, it is. I think there's so much in just that brief part of chapter 8, but also the one thing I do want people to come away from my lecture with is to not be afraid of Chinese characters, and also to realize that the Chinese characters that are written out there, they can easily, with the software and whatnot that's available now. I mean, back when I first started studying Chinese, you had to learn how to use a dictionary, which was a pain in the butt. And even after you learned how to use a dictionary, it was frustrating because sometimes you just couldn't find a character. It would be somehow listed, it would be indexed differently. Or nowadays and I want to give, one of the things I'm going to do is I want everyone who comes to my lecture, I'm going to tell them, you need to download this on your phone. This is kind of how you use it. I'm not going to do a tutorial, but I'm just going to give them an idea of how to use it. And this is where you can go to find etymologies all over the internet now. It used to be, I bought this book, would have been 15 years ago now. And at the time I was so excited. But the amount of information that's on the internet now that you can easily access, even as an English speaker, far surpasses anything that I have in my library. And so, you can go in there, you could be curious about some passage in the Yellow Empress Classic, and you could sit down there and you can really get in there and start to see the living world, the pictures, that the imagery that was created there, that has information in it that you don't even need to translate, because it's an actual picture. It's like looking at someone doing something. Yeah.
I love it. When people want to engage with you further, you are a professor at NUNM currently, or not anymore?
No. Now I am. If they want to contact me, I mean, I'm happy to give you my email, or I'm on social media. I don't really use it that much.
What about at the Clinic 11? I know you had the Clinic 11 in Portland.
Right. So I closed that in 2020. And now I am, I have a clinic space at home. I have another space that I share with a friend. I'm not looking for more patients. I'm just kind of doing my studies. I have the people that I'm working with. I'm really focused right now. And this is something that we talked about before it started. But basically in 2020, I had a clinic in Chinatown, about a half block from the Lansu Chinese Garden, where I'm now the architectural conservator. But I had a clinic there, and like a lot of people, 2020 was a year of significant change for me. We ended up closing that clinic. Chinatown was sort of inundated with people that are genuinely suffering, the homeless people and the disenfranchised in Portland. They all got funneled into Chinatown. So it became a tent city there. We had to close the clinic. I moved back home. I had an opportunity to just really study and get back more into the classics, and just reading all these books that had kind of stacked up that I, kind of barely touched or just been nibbling at, because, I was kind of working and doing things in the clinic all day, and then getting home and, reading for a few hours. I started devoting time to that. And so now I've really shifted my focus for the, probably for the next decade. I want to just really study and write. I want to grow Chinese herbs and whatnot in my yard, so I can start to understand them a little better, because you learn so much about the herb and the plant from watching it through its life cycle. I mean, I don't know how many times I've prescribed or I've told people that they should take lotus seeds for this, that, and the other thing. I've even found ways that they work. But now having some lotuses in my little pond in the backyard and having to care for them, and seeing the lotuses at the Chinese garden and learning how to care for them and watching them go through their cycle, they're really starting to make sense. I'm seeing more where they would fit into a formula, where they would fit into what they could be used for. I'm seeing a lot more uses for them than I did before. So I really want to pare down the herbs that I use, and I want to focus more on herbs just in general in terms of treating, providing health and disease, but pare them down and understand them better, and just kind of get into the depths of my understanding of Chinese medicine and my relationship with the people that I'm trying to help and whatnot.
And then the professor in you, you're not a professor currently employed, but once a professor, always a professor. I imagine after your deep dive and discoveries, you'll want to come out and share those with other people, just like you're doing at Symposium. So.
Yeah, I do. It's sometimes I feel like it's, like you shake a bottle up and then you take the lid off and, there's this explosion. Like just in talking to you, so many of these ideas, I've been just in the last few months, I've read this whole new crop of books on physics and artificial intelligence and also this new discoveries with the role of mitochondria and the development of eukaryotics and its role just in living cells, the human body, but just living cells in general. But I haven't had much of I've been writing my own things, but I haven't had much of an opportunity to actually talk to anyone because I'm just kind of doing my own thing. But yeah, so it feels like almost like this explosion of ideas when I do get to finally talk to someone. In a way, it feels, there's something about it that feels, it's almost like a deflated feeling that I get. It's like, it's almost like I vomited it all out.
You have given us a lot. I hope you don't feel like you vomited because you've given us all so much just in this. Imagine 3 hours of this deep dive and then being able to, you'll never be the same. You're going to go out into the world and look at it so differently. I just love that. I really hope, and I will be following you to see, the other books that are coming out, the other lectures that are coming out. And if anybody is in Portland, you can probably go see Gabe at the Chinese Garden, because one thing that I haven't revealed yet is that besides being an author, professor, translator, educator, physician of naturopathic medicine and Chinese medicine, and now obviously an herbalist, he is a Mason and has done extensive work with the Portland Chinese Garden to rectify or actually just kind of correct some aging architecture there using ancient Chinese masonry that you went and studied in China and then brought it back and then helped them save some of this architecture that was, falling apart literally. And as you were doing that, you were again seeing Chinese medicine in how even just working on the structure of the building at the garden is very similar to working on the structure of the human body. And it's like the same principles apply. And it's like, you just constantly are seeing. Can you just take a second to explain the difference between holographic and holotropic? Because I'm kind of dancing around that concept right now.
Yeah. So that was something that I mentioned. I think I in my description of the lecture, I used the word holotropic, and that I first came across that word in a book this was a long time ago, by Stanislav Grof, The Holotropic Mind. He talks a lot about, these perinatal matrices and a lot about the way, these kind of themes in our lives recur on an immediate way, on an hourly way, anytime we undergo a task over the course of a year, say over the course of a relationship of a lifetime, but the way all of those can kind of go back to this very small event, the event of us, being born, and the way that we navigated that first crisis emerging from the womb out into the world. That's all Stanislav Grof's work. But I like that work. I like that word holotropic. I like it better than Holographic, which was an earlier book by, I think, Michael Talbot. I might be forgetting the name of the author, but he had the book, The Holographic Universe. I know that's the name of the book, but in any case, the reason why I like holotropic better is it does really include the mind and language, what I think of as language. When I think about language, I'm really talking about these systems of analogies that allow the mind to process information in a way that is meaningful, to create meaning from all this soup of information that's outside of us. And in that way, each of us has our own kind of holotropic lens through which we perceive the world, the cosmos, what's happening around us, and how we also then can relate it to other people through either what we create or do or say. I think for me the real distinction is, I think the ideas were the same. I think that the internal ideas were the same, but I think with Stanislav Grof, he really brought out how our own psyche creates these. I keep wanting to use the word gestalt, but gestalt sounds very static. But in any case, creates these forms. They're dynamic forms. So gestalt isn't necessarily the best way to phrase it, but create these dynamic forms, then recreate themselves throughout our lives. And in terms of health and disease, it's very important, because in chapter 8 of the Yellow Emperor's Classic, in the treatise of the secret library of the miraculous orchid, the Linglan Median Lun, it's talking about this network of 12 officials, how they relate to one another. And once you understand them individually, you can kind of start to think, and it's maybe a little difficult for us because the metaphor that was used in this book was written at a time when there was a particular system of government that probably seemed kind of imminent to the early Chinese thinker. You had the minister and the emperor and these types of things, and the names for those roles were tied together with these more kind of elemental descriptions of kind of cosmic descriptions of how that role might fit into the larger cosmos. But in any case, when you start thinking about these larger networks and you think about the person who's in front of you, you can kind of start to see how these particular aspects of the person, these particular roles that are playing a part within the person, what their disharmonies might be, and how you might be able to restore them to health by making adjustments here and there to these relationships. Because the Yellow Emperor asks, he says, I'm gonna have to put my glasses on because I need glasses these days, but Huangdi Wan Ye, Yu Wan Tian Yi. Oh, sorry, I'm in the wrong. I've opened up chapter 9 there. Yuan Wan Shi Er Zang Zhi Xiang Shi Gui Jian He Ru. He wants to know about the 12 zang, the 12 organs, the 12 treasures. They're xiang shi, they're mutual. Xiang, even this character Xiang is very interesting because it shows a tree and then an eye. And so today it's often translated as mutual. Like xiang, it means like yin yang xiang hu, yin yang xiang ban, like the yin and yang are mutually rooted in one another. But xiang literally was this tree and then an eye looking at it. And it used to mean to inspect something. So, but when you think about some type of mutual relationship, it's the object and the subject are in a relationship with one another.
They have to be.
Yeah, that's what a mutuality is. It's how the subjective and the objective relate to one another. So xiang literally meant to inspect. So in one kind of understanding of that kind of etymology would be you've got a tree. It's essentially an inanimate object that you want to do something with. But you first, you have to look at it. You know, you have to see, is that tree going to be good for what I want? You go out into the woods, you have to look around for the tree. Once you find the tree, you have to look at it and be like, is this the one? How am I going to use it? There's a long period of time where you're looking at the wood, you're looking at the tree before you can kind of use it. So xiang has this kind of mutual kind of subject object relationship to it. And then the character shi, you have a person, and then you have someone writing, but they're kind of writing something down. Shi can mean to like, to send a message or to communicate, to somehow, to extend your will on something outside yourself through some intelligent means, through writing. But that's just a metaphor for how you would get something to happen. So xiang shi could be like their mutual interaction with one another. But again, it's the subject object. How are they working with one another, and how are they creating like an intelligent dialogue between one another to influence each other? And so when you look at each of these elements in this kind of cybernetic network, and you understand the etymology, any practitioner, even student, you know, who's in the clinic, you'll immediately be able to kind of start using that in your clinical practice. I would think.
Love it. I love it. And it will only help you be a better practitioner, to be able to look at things with different dimensions and from different lenses, right? I just love it. I love it. This entire talk, I know we've gone way over time. But thank you for that. Thank you for going over time. Thank you for sharing even more than what we thought we were going to get into, which is your discussion at Symposium. And then just so much more. If you guys want to find Gabe, you got to come to Symposium, find him on social media, find him on his website. I'm sure you can email him that way. And keep your eyes out for the work that is going to come out of this person, because I can already tell that as you explore and uncover more, you're going to share it more with the world and our community. And I'm thrilled. I'm very grateful for this conversation.
Oh, well, it's been a pleasure talking with you. And
I'll see you, because I'll be at Symposium myself.
You.
And if I'm in Portland, I'm coming to the Chinese Garden to see your work. I know you're at the Vancouver Chinese Garden as well.
Yeah.
And I mean, just talk about dimensions and multifaceted. You're the guy. You're the guy. So guys, anybody listening or watching in, come to Symposium or watch Symposium or buy this recording later on, because you're going to get a lot more out of it than you think. Like you said earlier, like the title of my talk doesn't really describe it, but it's so perfect because that's illustrative of what you're talking about.
Right. Absolutely.
All right, my friend. I'll see you in a couple months at Symposium.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.